An emperor's command is only as powerful as the system that carries it out. We remember the glittering monuments and epic conquests of ancient empires, but these achievements rested on a hidden foundation. This is the story of the vast, unseen machinery that made empires possible. By the end, you will understand the real levers of power that shaped the ancient world. How did a ruler in Rome issue an order that was obeyed on a distant desert frontier? What kept a sprawling domain from splintering into 100 independent pieces? The answers lie not in tales of battles, but in the quiet, relentless work of administration. We are about to pull back the curtain on the greatest trick of imperial history, the intricate systems of information, supply, and control that functioned across thousands of miles without a single telephone or computer. These bureaucracies were the hidden wiring of civilization, the crucial framework everyone forgets. To grasp them is to see how power was truly exercised and sustained, far from the throne room and the battlefield. What do you believe is the true source of an empire's strength? Every empire from the very first faced the same impossible equation. How do you rule a territory you can never see? A ruler in a capital city might govern lands that would take months, even years, to traverse. Their authority had to stretch across mountain ranges, deserts, and seas, reaching communities that spoke different languages and worshipped different gods. The idealized map showed a unified realm, a single color stretching from horizon to horizon. But the reality on the ground was a patchwork of local loyalties, ancient traditions, and practical needs. This was the empire's great dilemma. Power centralized in one person, but the world they claimed was impossibly decentralized. Three fundamental problems made this so difficult. First, the problem of time. A command sent from the center would be old news by the time it arrived. A crisis on a distant frontier could be over for months before the emperor even learned it had begun. This communication lag meant local governors had to make real decisions with real consequences, often without guidance. Were they still loyal representatives, or were they becoming independent rulers in all but name? Second, the problem of resources. An empire survives by moving wealth from the provinces that produce it to the capital and the armies that consume it. But moving grain, timber, or silver across a continent is a monumental task. It requires roads, ships, storage, and security. A tax collected as wheat in a fertile valley is useless if it rots before reaching the soldiers who need to eat it. The entire system could starve not from a lack of food, but from a failure of distribution. And third, perhaps the most dangerous, was the problem of information. The ruler in the palace depended entirely on reports from the edges of their domain. But what if a local governor, facing a poor harvest, underreported the grain yield to keep his people from starving? What if a military commander exaggerated a threat to secure more troops and funding? The center was often blind, forced to make decisions based on accounts that could be outdated, incomplete, or deliberately misleading. This information asymmetry meant an empire could be quietly weakening, its foundations eroding, while its leader received only news of peace and prosperity. The glittering image of unity was constantly threatened by the quiet, grinding friction of distance. To solve this, empires had to invent something new, not a weapon, but a system. They had to build a nervous system. The solution began not with a grand proclamation, but with a simple mark pressed into wet clay. Long before epic poems were composed or sacred texts were inscribed, writing was born as a tool of pure administration. This was the first information revolution, and its purpose was shockingly practical: to make the invisible visible to a distant ruler. In places like ancient Sumer, along the fertile banks of the Tigris and Euphrates, the challenge was not a lack of wealth, but an inability to track it. A temple complex might receive thousands of baskets of grain, hundreds of livestock, and endless jars of oil from surrounding farms. How could one priest or one official possibly remember it all? The human mind was a leaky vessel, and memory alone was a fragile chain of command. So they began to make physical tokens, little clay shapes representing a sheep, a jar, a measure of grain. These tokens were sealed inside hollow clay balls, but you could not see what was inside without breaking the ball. The breakthrough came when someone pressed the token into the surface of the clay ball before sealing it, creating a visible record on the outside. Eventually, they realized the tokens themselves were unnecessary. The impression on a flat tablet was enough. With a reed stylus, they made wedge-shaped marks, cuneiform, and bureaucracy was born. This was not art or literature, it was an accounting system. A tablet from the city of Uruk might simply list 32 head of cattle, 120 baskets of barley, the wages for 40 laborers for 1 month. With that tablet, a supervisor in the capital could know with certainty what existed in a storehouse a week's journey away. The empire could now have a memory beyond any single person's lifetime. Egypt refined this concept with papyrus, a lighter, more portable medium. Scribes conducted meticulous censuses, not just counting people, but recording their professions, their land holdings, even the number of cattle they owned. For the pharaoh in Thebes, a scroll could reveal the productive capacity of an entire nome or province. He could see, on paper, the human and economic resources of his kingdom. He knew where to send grain in a lean year and where to levy more troops for a campaign. In China, the earliest oracle bones used for divination gradually gave way to a standardized script perfected by the Qin dynasty's clerks. This uniform writing was not for poets, it was the glue of state control. A legal decree written in the same characters could be understood by officials from the dusty western frontiers to the coastal rice paddies. A tax assessment from the central ministry meant the same thing everywhere. Writing became the ultimate tool for standardization, erasing local ambiguity and creating a single, official reality dictated by the center. In each case, the script itself evolved for clarity and efficiency, not beauty. Cuneiform was ideal for quick, consistent impressions in clay. Egyptian hieratic script was a simplified, cursive form of hieroglyphs designed for the speed of daily record-keeping. These were the fonts of their day, created for the civil servant, not the sculptor. This administrative writing created a new class of power, the scribe. The man who could read the tablets and write the decrees held immense, quiet influence. He was the gatekeeper of information, the translator of the ruler's will into actionable orders. His work was mundane, recording harvests, tallying taxes, copying legal codes, but it was this relentless, unglamorous documentation that built the framework of empire. It turned the chaotic, organic reality of a vast territory into neat columns of data that could be stored, compared, and audited. For the first time, a state could project its vision of order across space and time, using symbols on clay and papyrus to bind distant lands to a single administrative will. The written word became the silent, omnipresent witness, ensuring that what was owed to the center was never forgotten. But a written order is useless if it cannot be delivered. The next great innovation was not in the medium, but in the movement. Empires realized that to govern distance, they had to defeat time itself, and they did this by building the ancient world's equivalent of the Internet, a high-speed information network. The master architects of this system were the Achaemenid Persians, rulers of an empire that stretched from the Aegean Sea to the Indus River. Their solution was the Royal Road. This was not a single path, but a meticulously maintained highway system over 1,500 miles long, linking the imperial capital of Susa to the vital city of Sardis in Anatolia. Its true genius, however, was not in the pavement but in the protocol that traveled upon it. This was the Angarium, the Imperial Postal Service. At regular intervals along the royal road, perhaps every 14 miles, stood a way station. At each one, a fresh horse and a rested courier stood ready. A messenger would ride at a gallop to the next station, hand off the sealed dispatches to the waiting rider, who would immediately mount a fresh horse and continue the sprint. This relay system meant messages could travel the entire length of the road in just 7 days, a journey that would take a normal caravan 3 months. Herodotus, the Greek historian, marveled at it, writing, "There is nothing in the world that travels faster than these Persian couriers. The message itself never stopped to eat, sleep, or rest." The empire had created a perpetual motion machine for information. This speed was a strategic weapon. A rebellion in a distant province could be reported to the king before it could fully organize. The king's decisive orders could return before the local governor even assumed the capital was unaware. The royal road did not just connect places, it collapsed the psychological space between the center and the periphery, making the presence of the king feel unnervingly immediate. This model was so effective that other empires copied and adapted it. The Romans perfected it with the cursus publicus, a vast network that used not only horsemen but wheeled vehicles for heavier cargo of state. Official travelers carried a diploma, a sealed certificate that granted them access to fresh horses, lodging, and supplies at government way stations. This system bound the Roman provinces to Italy, moving tax revenues, military reports, and imperial edicts with bureaucratic efficiency. Perhaps the most breathtaking adaptation came in the Andes Mountains, where the Inca Empire faced a terrain impossible for wheels or horses. Their solution was the chasqui, a corps of highly trained relay runners. Stations were placed closer together, sometimes every mile, given the altitude and steep terrain. A chasqui would sprint his segment, carrying oral messages or knotted cord records called quipu, and pass the information verbatim to the next runner waiting at a small stone hut. Through this system, fresh fish from the coast could reach the Inca ruler in the highland capital of Cusco in under 24 hours. The message was more important than the messenger. In each of these systems, the individual courier was anonymous, a replaceable component in a grand machine. His loyalty was to the system itself, to the protocol of the handoff. This depersonalization was its strength. It eliminated the variable of a single person's endurance or motivation. The empire's will became a constant, flowing current. The true power here was not military but logistical. A fast-moving army could conquer territory, but only a fast-moving message could hold it. The ability to know what was happening everywhere and to respond faster than any local rival could mobilize was the ultimate deterrent against fracture. It turned the empire's greatest weakness, its vast size, into a source of strength, as the center could project its authority along these neural pathways faster than dissent could spread. The road and the runner were the arteries, and information was the lifeblood. But what good was information if you could not trust the person sending it? Information was power, but it required a constant, accurate feed of data. For an empire to function, its rulers needed to know precisely what they owned, not in vague terms but in hard numbers. This led to the creation of the state's ultimate inventory, a dual system that quantified its two most vital resources, its people and its land. The census and the cadastre were the bureaucratic tools that made this possible, transforming living communities and ancient landscapes into columns of taxable, manageable data. The census was far more than a simple head count. In the ancient world, it was the mechanism by which a state located its wealth and its manpower. Take the census ordered by the first Roman emperor, Augustus. This was not an exercise in democratic representation. It was a vast military and financial audit of the entire Roman world. Officials fanned out across provinces, visiting towns and villages to record every male citizen, his age, his property, and his family. The purpose was brutally practical. The register identified who was eligible for military service, creating a ready list of legionaries. More importantly, it meticulously catalogued property and wealth, determining exactly how much tax each individual and community owed to the imperial treasury. The state now had a map of its human and economic capital. A similar drive for order occurred in Han Dynasty China, where detailed household registers were maintained. These records listed not just the head of a family, but every member, their relationships, and even their ages. This allowed the Han state to efficiently collect the head tax and corvée labor, the mandatory work on state projects like roads and canals that built the empire's infrastructure. The census made the population legible to a distant administration, turning millions of individuals into a categorized, manageable resource. But people lived on land, and land produced wealth. To tax that wealth effectively, you needed to understand the land itself. This was the role of the cadastre, a detailed land register that was the census's geographical twin. Imagine teams of surveyors armed with measuring ropes and simple sighting instruments, walking the boundaries of every field, vineyard, and pasture in a province. They recorded the owner, the size, the type of soil, the quality, and the estimated yield. In Egypt, these records were astonishingly precise, noting which plots were irrigated by the annual Nile flood and which were not, as this directly determined their value and tax burden. The cadastre did something profound. It turned territory into a spreadsheet. A forest was no longer just a forest, it was a timber resource of a certain acreage. A valley was not merely beautiful, it was so many units of wheat-producing capacity. This transformation of landscape into data allowed for a standardized tax assessment. A governor in a distant palace could look at a scroll and know that District 7 owed 10,000 sacks of grain, not because he guessed, but because the cadastre said its fields could produce exactly that. It removed arbitrariness, or at least claimed to, replacing the whim of a local tax collector with the cold, impersonal logic of a central register. Together, these twin systems of counting and mapping created a framework of control that was difficult to evade. They minimized the information asymmetry that plagued early rulers. No local magistrate could easily hide a thriving new village or a fertile, untaxed field from the imperial scribes forever. The census and cadastre made evasion a matter of falsifying official records, a high-stakes crime against the state itself. This bureaucratic gaze, this relentless drive to quantify, was the foundation of imperial endurance. It funded the armies that defended the frontiers and built the roads that carried the couriers. It turned the abstract idea of an empire into a functioning, revenue-generating machine. Yet this very system, for all its efficiency, created its own tensions. What happened when the state's neat columns of data met the messy, resistant reality of human life and local tradition? Yet all this counting and measuring meant nothing without a common language of value. A tax assessed in one province as a measure of barley, and in another as a weight of silver, created a fog of confusion ripe for exploitation. To clear that fog, empires imposed a new kind of order, one that reached into the marketplace and the tax collector's bag, standardizing the very tools of exchange. They created uniform weights, measures, and most powerfully, state-issued money. This was not merely an economic upgrade, it was a profound assertion of control over daily life. Imagine a merchant traveling from Memphis to Damascus. In one city, the local cubit for measuring cloth might be the length of a governor's forearm. In the next, it was based on a temple's sacred stone. A talent of copper could weigh vastly different amounts from one valley to the next. This chaos was a bureaucrat's nightmare and a cheat's paradise. It made long-distance trade a gamble and centralized taxation a labyrinth of conversion rates and arguments. The imperial solution was to declare one official standard, often embodied in a physical prototype kept in a capital temple or palace. The most famous may be the royal cubit of ancient Egypt, a precisely carved rod of black granite that defined the standard length for surveying fields, building monuments, and taxing harvests. Copies were distributed to officials across the land. Suddenly, a plot of land in Thebes and a plot in Aswan could be measured with the same stick, and their tax burden calculated using the same formulas. The Qin dynasty in China, obsessed with uniformity, famously standardized not just the written script, but the axle widths of carts, the units of volume for grain, and the increments of weight. This allowed their famously efficient bureaucracy to function seamlessly, moving resources and administering justice with a consistent set of rules. But the ultimate tool of standardization was coinage. Before coins, trade relied on barter or on weighing out precious metal bullion, a slow process requiring scales and constant testing for purity. Then, around the 7th century before the Common Era, the Lydians in Anatolia began stamping lumps of electrum, a natural gold and silver alloy with official marks. This idea was revolutionary, and it was the empires that saw its true potential. The Persian daric, a coin of consistent gold purity issued by the royal treasury, became the trusted currency of an empire. Its value was guaranteed not by the merchant who handed it to you, but by the power of the King of Kings himself. It meant a soldier stationed in Egypt could be paid in the same currency that bought grain in Babylon, simplifying logistics enormously. The Romans took this concept to its zenith with the denarius. This silver coin was more than money. It was a miniature billboard circulating to the farthest reaches of the provinces. On one side, the profile of the emperor, a daily reminder of whose peace guaranteed the coin's value. On the reverse, images of gods, victories, or monuments celebrating imperial power. Every time a farmer paid his taxes or a shopper bought bread, they held a piece of Rome in their hand. The coin declared the economic unity of the empire and broadcast state propaganda directly into the palm of every citizen. This system of standards did something subtle yet immense. It built trust in the abstract authority of the state. You did not need to know or personally trust the merchant across the table. You trusted the emperor's mark on the coin. You did not need to argue with the tax assessor over the size of his measuring basket. You both used the same royal standard. It reduced friction, fraud, and conflict, accelerating the flow of goods and taxes that fed the imperial machine. The bureaucracy now had a clear mathematical language for its spreadsheets, a language spoken from the palace to the frontier outpost. But this very efficiency, this top-down imposition of order, inevitably grated against the ancient rhythms of local life and belief. Yet this entire system of roads, registers, and coins relied on a crucial human component. The silent, steady force that made the machine run was not a king or a general, but the scribe. This was a specialized class of literate officials, the clerks and accountants who formed the indispensable human engine of imperial administration. They were the living interface between the vast, often illiterate population and the abstract demands of the state. To become a scribe was to enter a world of rigorous discipline. In ancient Egypt, a young boy from a respectable family, perhaps the son of a minor official or a craftsman, would be sent to a school attached to a temple or a royal palace. His education was not about philosophy or art, but about utility. For years, he practiced copying hundreds of standard administrative texts, from tax receipts and land deeds to model letters and legal formulas. He learned the complex hieratic script, a faster, cursive version of hieroglyphs designed specifically for bureaucracy. His training ground was the ostraca, a broken piece of pottery, where he would scratch out exercises in accounting or penmanship. The message was clear: precision and repetition were virtues. A single error in a tax roll or a legal decree could have serious consequences, so the training aimed to eliminate individuality in favor of flawless uniformity. The life of a scribe was famously promoted as superior to all other professions. One ancient Egyptian text, the Satire of the Trades, vividly describes the hardships of other jobs: the potter covered in mud, the farmer exhausted under the sun, the soldier facing constant danger. The scribe, by contrast, is portrayed as clean, respected, and free from manual labor. His tool was the reed brush, his battlefield was the papyrus scroll, and his power was derived from knowledge. He recorded harvests, calculated rations for work crews, drafted wills, and copied royal decrees. Without him, the state's memory vanished, its laws became mere words, and its wealth became an unmeasured mystery. In China, this concept evolved into one of history's most influential bureaucratic systems, the scholar official class. Here, the path to power was explicitly tied to literacy and learning, but with a profound twist. Through the imperial examination system, established in earnest by the Han and perfected by later dynasties, any man, at least in theory, could achieve office by demonstrating his mastery of the Confucian classics and his skill in composition and administration. This created a meritocratic ideal where governance was entrusted not solely to nobles or warriors, but to the educated. These scholar officials became the backbone of the Chinese Empire for 2,000 years. They collected taxes, administered justice, maintained public works, and wrote the endless reports that kept the emperor informed. They were a self-perpetuating pillar of stability. Their shared education in a common ethical and literary tradition, creating a unified administrative culture across a continent-sized empire. Whether in Egypt or China, the scribe occupied a unique social space. He was typically of the middling sort, not born to the highest nobility, yet wielding immense soft power. He was the gatekeeper, a farmer appealing a tax assessment, a merchant seeking a travel permit, a soldier claiming his pay, all had to go through him. He alone could read the regulations, interpret the edicts, and produce the necessary documentation. This made him both indispensable and potentially corrupt, a figure to be both respected and feared. His loyalty was to the system and its written rules, which gave him a certain autonomy even from his immediate superiors. The bureaucracy, through these men, developed its own momentum and culture, outlasting individual rulers and dynasties. They were the true keepers of the empire's continuity, ensuring that the procedures for counting grain, mustering troops, and recording laws survived the rise and fall of any single emperor. They turned the grand, fleeting ambitions of kings into the durable, daily routines of governance. The scribe's work did not end when the ink dried. Every tax receipt, every land survey, every copy of an imperial decree represented a piece of the empire's operational knowledge, and that knowledge had to be preserved. This gave rise to one of bureaucracy's most enduring monuments, the State Archive, a physical fortress for institutional memory. In the heart of ancient Babylon, within the sacred precinct, stood rooms filled not with treasure, but with shelves of organized clay tablets. Each tablet, once inscribed and sun-dried or fired, was a permanent record. They were often stored in labeled baskets or on shelves, arranged by year, by official, or by subject matter, such as temple offerings, merchant contracts, or royal correspondence. These archives were not dusty tombs for forgotten paperwork. They were active, vital organs of the state. A governor disputing a boundary could send a clerk to retrieve a survey from 20 years prior. A priest could verify the traditional offerings due to a temple by consulting century-old ledgers. The archive allowed the administration to function with consistency, turning the past into a reference library for governing the present. The Romans institutionalized this concept with structures like the Tabularium, the record hall overlooking the Forum in Rome. Here, the public records of the state, inscribed on bronze or papyrus, were stored in a secure, organized manner. The very architecture spoke to its importance, a massive, fortified building meant to last for ages. For an empire built on law, precedent was everything. A legal case could hinge on a decree issued by an emperor long since past. and only the official copy in the archives held ultimate authority. This created a powerful continuity. The state's obligations and rights were not based on the memory or whim of the current official, but on a retrievable, written past. Similarly, in pharaonic Egypt, the House of Life, associated with major temples, served as scriptorium, library, and archive. Papyrus scrolls, though more fragile than clay, were carefully catalogued and stored in jars or chests to protect them from insects and humidity. These scrolls contained everything from tax census data to architectural plans for royal tombs, ensuring that the complex rituals of state and religion could be performed correctly, generation after generation, according to established precedent. This relentless record-keeping created an empire that could, in a sense, remember. It outlasted the lifespan of any administrator, any general, even any dynasty. When a new ruler took the throne, he did not inherit a blank slate. He inherited filing cabinets of obligations, treaties, land grants, and tax codes. This institutional memory constrained chaos. A rebellious provincial governor could not easily rewrite history or claim ancient privileges, not when the central archive held the original documents proving otherwise. The archive was the ultimate weapon against amnesia and the fragmentation it caused. It turned governance from a personal exercise of power into a systematic application of rules, where the past was always present, quietly guiding every administrative decision. Yet this very system, designed for perfect order, created its own vulnerabilities for what happens when the weight of perfect records meets the imperfect reality of human need and ambition. But a perfect archive is only as strong as the officials who consult it. The true test of an imperial system was not in the capital, but out in the provinces, where a single appointed individual wielded the emperor's power over thousands. How could a ruler delegate such immense authority without creating a rival? The solution was not to eliminate the governor's power, but to cleverly fracture it, building structural checks and balances directly into the model of provincial rule. One of the earliest and most sophisticated systems was the Persian satrapy. The empire was divided into around 20 massive provinces called satrapies, each governed by a satrap, a title meaning protector of the kingdom. But the satrap was never alone. He shared power with two other key officials appointed directly by the King of Kings. First was the military commander of the province's garrison, who reported separately to the royal army. This meant the satrap controlled the civil administration and collected taxes, but he did not have unilateral command over the soldiers stationed in his territory. Second, and perhaps more crucially, was the royal treasurer, who oversaw the provincial treasury and ensured the correct flow of tax revenue back to the central coffers. This division of financial and military power was a masterstroke. The satrap could not fund a rebellion without the treasurer's compliance, and he could not command the troops without the military commander's loyalty. To ensure this delicate balance held, the Persians added a third layer, the king's eye or royal inspector. These trusted agents traveled unexpectedly throughout the empire, auditing records, listening to grievances, and reporting directly back to the king. The satrap lived under a constant, invisible audit, knowing that any move toward independence could be swiftly reported and crushed. This model of divided responsibility created a stable, if tense, equilibrium that held the vast Persian realm together for centuries. The Romans, pragmatic adapters of successful ideas, developed their own version with the provincial system under a proconsul. A Roman province was typically governed by a single individual, a former consul or praetor, who held near absolute civil and military authority for his one-year term. This concentration of power was dangerous, and Rome's genius lay in the constraints built around it. The term limit itself was critical, preventing a governor from putting down deep roots or building a personal army over many years. His performance was subject to review at the end of his term, and he could be prosecuted for corruption or abuse. Furthermore, while he commanded the legions in his province, the loyalty of those legions was first to Rome itself, embodied in the Senate and the people, not to the proconsul personally. The soldiers swore an oath to the Roman state, and their pay came from the central treasury. A governor contemplating rebellion had to convince not just his officers, but an entire legion that their future was better served by betraying Rome, a formidable psychological hurdle. The system relied on a culture of republican virtue and the gravitational pull of Rome's prestige, making the idea of a breakaway province seem both treasonous and foolish. In China, the Qin and Han dynasties engineered perhaps the most centralized model, the commandery system. The empire was carved into administrative units called commanderies, each overseen by a centrally appointed governor and a separate military commander. Their roles were strictly segregated. The governor handled civil affairs, law, and taxation, while the military commander defended the borders and maintained order, but he could not levy taxes or interfere in civilian administration. Both officials reported along separate channels directly to the capital. This created a clear, parallel structure of authority where each official acted as a check on the other. Additionally, the Chinese implemented a policy of avoidance where officials were never posted to their home regions. A man from the south might govern a northern commandery. This prevented him from relying on local family ties or loyalties, forcing him to depend entirely on the central government for his authority and his future career prospects. His success was measured by his ability to implement imperial policy and maintain stability, not by cultivating a local power base. In each of these models, the central insight was the same: trust no single individual with complete power in a distant land. By dividing military command from financial control, by imposing term limits, by sending inspectors, and by mandating reporting lines that bypassed the provincial capital, empires engineered a system where ambition was channeled inward toward pleasing the center rather than outward toward defying it. The provincial governor was made powerful enough to govern effectively, but his power was always conditional, resting on a foundation carefully designed to crumble if he ever tried to lift it for himself. The emperor's will, channeled through governors and scribes, still faced its final and most delicate test, the moment of collection. How does a state actually gather the wealth it has so carefully counted and measured? The answer reveals a fundamental tension at the heart of imperial power, a choice between two very different systems, each with profound consequences for the people who paid. On one side stood the state collector, a salaried official. On the other, the tax farmer, a private entrepreneur. The empire's stability often hung on which hand reached into the citizen's purse. Consider the tax farmer, a figure who became infamous across the ancient Mediterranean. This was not a government employee, but a private individual or a company of wealthy investors. The process was starkly simple. The Roman state, for example, would announce it needed to collect a certain sum from a province. Groups of financiers would bid in an auction for the contract to gather those taxes. The highest bidder won. They paid the state its demanded sum upfront in a lump sum. Then, armed with the state's authority, they fanned out into the countryside to recoup their investment plus a profit. The system was brilliantly efficient for the central treasury, which received its money immediately and without the cost of maintaining a vast core of its own collectors. It transferred the risk and the administrative headache to private hands, but this efficiency came at a terrible human cost. For the tax farmer, profit was everything. There was no fixed limit on what he could collect beyond what the market would bear and what fear could enforce. To maximize his return, he had every incentive to squeeze the province dry, employing armed guards to intimidate, charging arbitrary fees, and loaning money at crushing rates to those who could not pay on time. The cries of the exploited fueled deep resentment, sparking rebellions that historians note destabilized regions for generations. The state got its money, but it outsourced its relationship with its own people, often breeding hatred toward the distant emperor who allowed such predation in his name. In stark contrast stood the model of the salaried state official, an ideal pursued with varying success by empires like Han China. Here, the collector was a government employee, paid a fixed wage, theoretically insulated from the temptation of personal profit. His duty was to gather the assessed amount as recorded in the cadastral surveys, no more and no less. This system aimed for fairness and direct control, tying the people's loyalty directly to the central state rather than to a greedy intermediary. It reflected a philosophy where governance was a public trust, but this model demanded a massive, expensive, and well-supervised bureaucracy. The state had to train, pay, and monitor thousands of officials to prevent them from simply becoming tax farmers in government robes, taking their own unofficial cuts. It required an immense investment in institutional integrity. When it worked, it could create a more stable and predictable relationship between the ruler and the ruled. When it failed, it created a layer of corruption that was harder to root out, as it was embedded within the state itself. This choice between the tax farmer and the state collector was the ultimate administrative dilemma. It boiled down to a simple, brutal calculation. Does the empire prioritize immediate, guaranteed revenue and minimal bureaucratic cost, accepting the social unrest that might follow? Or does it invest heavily in a salaried civil service to foster long-term stability and direct loyalty, risking inefficiency and internal corruption? The Roman Republic often chose the former, a decision that enriched the equestrian class and filled the treasury, but also planted the seeds of provincial revolt. The Han emperors strived for the latter, building an examination system to create a class of scholar officials meant to govern justly. Each system left a different mark on the historical record, one often written in the ledgers of creditors, the other in the manuals of administrative law. This relentless need for revenue, the lifeblood of the imperial machine, forced empires to make a choice about what kind of power they wanted to be and who would bear the brunt of its cost. Revenue was the empire's fuel, but its ultimate currency was food. An army could not march on silver, and a capital city of 1 million souls could not survive on promises. The true measure of an empire's administrative genius was its ability to move mountains of grain across continents and store it for years, transforming the harvest of distant fields into the daily bread of soldiers and citizens. This was the empire's digestive system, a vast network of supply lines and granaries that turned agricultural surplus into sustained power. The most famous of these ancient breadbaskets was the relationship between Egypt and Rome. Each year, a fleet of specially designed grain ships, the navis honoraria, would gather in the port of Alexandria. Their holds were filled with wheat, a tribute tax paid by the fertile Nile Valley. Guided by the seasonal winds, this fleet would embark on a dangerous 2 to 3 week voyage across the Mediterranean, the Annona fleet carrying the sustenance of Rome itself. The arrival of these ships in the port of Ostia was a moment of high political drama. A delay meant hunger in the city, and hunger meant riots. The Roman state, therefore, did not leave this to chance. It managed the entire chain, from assessing the Egyptian harvest to contracting shipowners to building the massive warehouses, the horrea, that lined the Tiber River. These granaries were not simple barns, they were feats of engineering designed for preservation. Raised floors prevented damp, clever ventilation systems controlled temperature, and regiments of clerks meticulously tracked every sack that entered and left. The grain was then distributed, not sold on the open market, but as a state-sponsored dole to hundreds of thousands of registered citizen families. This system, the annona, did more than prevent starvation. It was a profound tool of political control. By guaranteeing basic food security to the urban populace of Rome, the emperor bought social peace. A well-fed city was a stable city, less likely to rally behind a rival. The grain dole created a direct personal bond of dependency between the citizen and the state, bypassing local patrons and senators. The emperor became the ultimate provider. But the system did not stop at the capital. All along the frontiers, at legionary fortresses from Britannia to Syria, stood military granaries. A single legion required tons of grain each month. Provincial governors were tasked with ensuring local harvests or shipments from elsewhere filled these depots. The ability to feed an army in place year-round was what allowed Rome to maintain a permanent, professional standing force on its borders. The army was not just a fighting force, it was a massive logistical entity that had to be fed, and its granaries were as strategically vital as its walls. On the other side of the world, Han Dynasty China developed a parallel system of breathtaking scale and philosophical intent, the ever-normal granaries. The name itself reveals its purpose: to maintain normalcy, to smooth out the natural bumps of feast and famine. The state would purchase grain from farmers after abundant harvests, when prices were low, and store it in a network of granaries spread across the empire. Then, during lean years or regional famines, officials would release this stored grain back onto the market, selling it at a fair price to prevent starvation and curb price gouging. This was not merely famine relief, it was a sophisticated attempt at economic stabilization. By intervening in the market, the state aimed to protect both the producer from ruinously low prices and the consumer from cripplingly high ones. It was a buffer against disaster, a manifestation of the Confucian ideal of benevolent governance. The granaries also served a crucial military function, supplying the armies guarding the Silk Road and the northern frontiers against nomadic incursions. The efficiency of this system was a direct reflection of the strength of the central bureaucracy. When the dynasty was strong and honest, the granaries were full and functioned as intended. When the bureaucracy weakened and corruption set in, the granaries might be empty or their contents sold for private profit, leading to catastrophe. The stored grain was thus a barometer of imperial health. These logistical networks, whether Roman or Chinese, shared a common insight. True power was not just about collecting food, but about mastering time and space. You had to move food across space from where it was grown to where it was needed, and you had to store it across time, holding it from season to season, from plenty to scarcity. The granary was where space and time met, a reservoir of security that allowed the empire to endure bad harvests, supply distant campaigns, and calm its nervous urban heart. It transformed the unpredictable rhythm of agriculture into the steady, reliable pulse of state power. The silent, dark interiors of these warehouses held more than just grain. They held the empire's confidence, its ability to look into an uncertain future and say, "We are prepared." But a predictable food supply required a predictable social order. Beyond the granary and the tax roll, empires faced the challenge of governing human conflict itself. For a central authority to mean anything, its justice had to reach further than its soldiers, touching the disputes of merchants in a dusty marketplace or farmers arguing over a boundary wall. This led to one of bureaucracy's most profound tools, the imposition of a single, standardized legal code designed to overwrite the patchwork of local customs with a clear, uniform script of state power. The goal was not necessarily fairness in a philosophical sense, but predictability. A merchant from one city needed to know that a contract signed in another would be enforced under the same rules. A landowner needed certainty that his property rights would be recognized by any official, anywhere in the realm. This legal uniformity turned the chaotic diversity of an empire into a governable space for commerce and control. One of the earliest and most striking declarations of this principle was the Code of Hammurabi. Erected on a towering stone stele in the heart of Babylon around 1750 before the Common Era, it was a public monument to the king's role as lawgiver. Its nearly 300 laws covered everything from trade and wages to family matters and construction standards. The famous principle of an eye for an eye was just one part of a much broader project to establish fixed consequences for actions, replacing blood feuds and arbitrary judgments with a stated, predictable penalty. Crucially, it was written in a public place for all to see, or more accurately, for the literate scribes to read aloud. This act of publication was revolutionary. The law was no longer a secret tradition held by elders. It was an official text, the same for everyone, at least in theory. It declared that justice flowed from the king and his administration, not from local chieftains or temple priests. While its punishment seemed harsh to modern eyes, its core innovation was its existence as a written, centralized standard. Later empires refined this model with breathtaking complexity. The Romans built not just a code of laws, but an entire science of jurisprudence, beginning with the 12 tables displayed in the Roman Forum, and expanding through centuries of edicts, senate decrees, and the opinions of learned jurists. Roman law became a sophisticated system for regulating an interconnected Mediterranean world. It provided clear rules for property ownership, inheritance, business contracts, and citizenship. This legal framework was what allowed a wine merchant in Gaul to form a partnership with a shipowner in Alexandria, both confident that their agreement would be upheld in a Roman court. The law created a safe platform for economic risk, fueling the empire's prosperity. The administration of this law fell to provincial governors. A Roman governor traveling his circuit, or conventus, was not just a military commander and tax overseer, he was the chief judge. People would bring their disputes before his tribunal, from boundary disagreements between powerful local landowners to cases of fraud between merchants. His job was to apply Roman law, or in some cases, local law if it did not conflict with Roman principles, to render a verdict. This practice did something subtle yet powerful. It made the distant emperor the ultimate arbiter of local justice. By resolving a dispute over a stolen donkey or a broken business deal, the governor's court demonstrated that the empire's authority was relevant to daily life. It offered a path to resolution that bypassed local clan loyalties and vendettas, channeling conflict into a state-managed process. The verdict and the force behind it came from Rome. This system was less concerned with the abstract ideal of justice for the poor and powerless, and more with maintaining order and protecting the economic interests that fed the state. Its predictability benefited those with property and social standing the most. Yet, by creating a single legal language for obligations and rights, it wove the provinces more tightly into the imperial fabric. A farmer might follow local customs for marriage, but if he sold a parcel of land, that transaction increasingly happened within the framework of imperial law, recorded by an imperial scribe and enforceable by an imperial official. The law code, therefore, was the ultimate bureaucratic instrument. It turned the messy, emotional realm of human conflict into a series of categorized cases with prescribed outcomes. It allowed authority to operate at a distance, through rules rather than through constant personal intervention. The Stone of Hammurabi and the scrolls of Roman jurists were more than lists of punishments. They were the operating system for empire, quietly installing the will of the center into the everyday logic of life at the edges. Yet a written law is powerless if no one ensures it is followed. The most elegant administrative system could still be sabotaged from within by the very officials who ran it. A governor grown comfortable in his province, a tax collector taking a little extra for himself, a military commander dreaming of his own glory, these were the quiet cracks that could bring an empire down. To find and seal those cracks, rulers created a shadow bureaucracy within the bureaucracy, a network of watchers whose sole purpose was to monitor the watchers themselves. This was the empire's immune system, a corps of inspectors, spies, and censors designed to instill a very specific kind of fear, not the fear of the enemy at the gate, but the fear of the unseen report traveling back to the throne. The model for this was set by the Achaemenid Persians, with officials known as the king's eyes, or sometimes the king's eyes and ears. These were not lowly informants, but high-ranking, trusted nobles directly appointed by the King of Kings. They traveled with small military escorts, appearing without warning at a satrap's palace or an army garrison. Their authority was absolute. They could audit financial records, inspect troop readiness, hear complaints from the local populace, and interrogate officials. Most importantly, they reported their findings along their own secure channels, bypassing the provincial governor entirely. For a satrap, the sight of a king's eye on the horizon was a moment of profound anxiety. It meant the distant, all-powerful monarch could suddenly see through his eyes and hear with his ears. This constant possibility of an unannounced audit made reckless corruption or open disloyalty a terrifying gamble. The system's genius was in its unpredictability. It created a panopticon effect where an official might behave simply because he could never be sure he wasn't being watched. The Romans, always practical adapters, developed their own versions. Initially, the task fell to the frumentarii, soldiers originally tasked with securing grain supplies, the frumentum. Their duty to travel between the legions and Rome made them perfect candidates for carrying secret messages and conducting discreet inquiries. Over time, their role expanded into domestic surveillance, checking on officials and gathering intelligence. By the later empire, this evolved into the agents in rebus, the agents of affairs. These were imperial couriers and inspectors rolled into one, operating under the Master of Offices, the Magister Officium. An agents in rebus could arrive in a province carrying what appeared to be routine dispatches, but his real mission might be to observe the governor's conduct, listen to local gossip, or verify the condition of roads and fortifications. Like their Persian predecessors, they represented the emperor's direct, penetrating gaze. Their presence was a reminder that a governor's power was on loan, subject to recall based on a confidential report that he might never see. The most formalized and influential system, however, emerged in China with the censorate. This was not a shadowy spy network, but an entire branch of government, a pillar of the state alongside the executive and the military. Established during the Qin dynasty and perfected by the Han, the censorate was staffed by scholar officials whose sacred duty was oversight. Their mandate was vast, to scrutinize the conduct of all other officials, from the highest minister down to the local magistrate. They investigated corruption, incompetence, and disloyalty. They could impeach officials based on their findings, presenting memorials directly to the emperor. They also served as the empire's conscience, criticizing imperial policies they deemed unwise or unjust, a remarkably structured form of internal critique. Censors traveled on tours of inspection, reviewing legal cases, examining tax records, and assessing the morale of the people. A corrupt county magistrate might hide his actions from his immediate superior, but he stood little chance against a seasoned censor sent from the capital with a mandate to dig. The censorate institutionalized the idea of accountability, making it a public, bureaucratic virtue rather than a secretive, royal whim. It bound the immense Chinese administrative class to a central code of conduct, with a dedicated office ensuring that code was more than just words on a scroll. The power of these systems lay less in the punishment they meted out, and more in the pervasive uncertainty they cultivated. An official could never be entirely sure if the merchant complaining about a tax was just a merchant or an agent provocateur. The junior clerk in the records room might be a loyal local, or he might be sending regular reports to the capital. This atmosphere of potential surveillance was a psychological leash. It encouraged officials to internalize the rules, to govern as if the emperor was standing invisibly at their shoulder. It made loyalty to the distant center a matter of daily, pragmatic choice. The inspector and the spy transformed the abstract authority of the throne into a tangible, ever-present possibility. They were the human circuitry that completed the feedback loop, allowing the center not just to command, but to verify, to correct, and to control. In doing so, they performed the ultimate bureaucratic magic trick. They made the empire feel smaller, tighter, and more intimately watched than its vast geography should ever have allowed. But all these inspectors and laws spoke in a specific tongue. The silent architecture of empire was held together by something as fluid and powerful as language itself. To govern a mosaic of peoples, rulers had to solve a fundamental problem of speech: how to issue commands that would be understood from one mountain valley to the next. Their solution was a deliberate language policy, the creation of an imperial lingua franca, a common tongue for the business of power. This was not about erasing local culture, but about building a parallel channel of communication that belonged solely to the state. The official language became the key that unlocked a unified administrative reality. Consider the Aramaic language under the vast Persian Empire. When the Achaemenid kings conquered territories from Egypt to India, they encountered a cacophony of languages: Egyptian hieroglyphs, Babylonian cuneiform, Lydian, Greek, and countless others. Imposing Persian on everyone would have been a monumental and rebellious task. Instead, they made a pragmatic choice. They adopted Aramaic, a language already widely used by merchants across the Near East, as the official language of imperial administration. Scribes from Syria to the Indus River learned to write Aramaic using an alphabetic script on papyrus or parchment, a far simpler system than cuneiform. This created a remarkable scene. A Persian king might issue a decree in his native Old Persian, carved on a cliff face at Behistun, but the working copy that traveled to the provinces, the document that tax collectors and garrison commanders actually used, was written in Aramaic. This decision created a class of bilingual local elites, the scribes and officials who could speak to their own people in a local dialect, but read and write the commands of the empire in Aramaic. They became the essential human bridges, the translators of imperial will into local action. The Roman Empire performed a similar, though more immersive, linguistic feat with Latin. Latin was the language of the law, the legions, and high administration. A city council in Roman Britain or North Africa conducted its official business in Latin. Its public inscriptions celebrating the emperor, its legal charters, its military diplomas granting citizenship to retired soldiers, all were in Latin. To rise in the Roman system, whether as a soldier seeking promotion to centurion or a provincial noble aspiring to the Senate, fluency in Latin was non-negotiable. It was the marker of Romanita's Romanness. This created a unified imperial elite. A senator from Spain and a landowner from Greece could converse in Latin, sharing a common cultural and political frame of reference that transcended their provincial origins. Yet, crucially, Rome rarely forced Latin on the common people in their daily lives. Greek remained the dominant language of commerce and culture in the Eastern Mediterranean. In the streets of Alexandria or Ephesus, people spoke Greek, worshipped in Greek, and told stories in Greek. Coptic, Punic, and Celtic languages persisted in homes and markets for centuries. The empire operated on a principle of diglossia, a high language for power and a low language for life. The state cared about compliance, not conversion at the most intimate levels. This system required a vast, often invisible core of translators and interpreters. In every provincial governor's staff, there were men who could translate a Latin edict into a local vernacular for public proclamation. In frontier markets and military outposts, bilingual individuals facilitated trade and treaty negotiations. Their work was the grease in the imperial machine, allowing it to run without grinding every local language into dust. The most sophisticated form of this linguistic divide was perhaps literary Chinese in East Asia. For over 2,000 years, across dynasties risen and fallen, literary Chinese served as the unchanging language of state, scholarship, and high culture. It was a written language deliberately divorced from the evolving spoken dialects. A scholar in Korea, Japan, or Vietnam could read a Chinese classical text or an imperial decree without being able to speak a word of Mandarin or Cantonese. This written language created a pan-Asian elite class, the scholar officials, who shared a common canon of philosophy, history, and administrative theory. It allowed the Chinese imperial model to be exported and adapted, as in Korea and Japan, without the need for linguistic conquest. Yet this very power created a profound social barrier. Mastery of this difficult, non-native written language required years of expensive education, effectively reserving positions of real power for the wealthy and well-connected. A brilliant farmer who spoke only his local dialect was locked out of the system. The administrative language became a wall separating the governing class, who lived in the world of texts and decrees, from the governed, who lived in the world of spoken tradition and local speech. This was the double edge of the imperial Lingua Franca. On one hand, it built unity, efficiency, and a trans-regional elite culture. On the other, it formalized a hierarchy where access to power was mediated by mastery of a state-sanctioned code. The language of administration was never just a tool for communication. It was a filter, determining who could speak to power and, more importantly, who power would listen to. It turned the babel of conquered peoples into an orderly chorus, but only a select few were taught the official lyrics. A wall that stretches across mountains is a statement of power, but the real power lies in the office that designed its payroll. The most breathtaking monuments of empire, the arrow-straight roads, the soaring aqueducts, and the vast defensive barriers, were first and foremost triumphs of administration. Before a single stone was laid, the state had to solve an equation of staggering complexity, coordinating thousands of laborers, millions of tons of material, and rivers of silver, all across years and vast distances. This was engineering by spreadsheet, where the project manager with his wax tablet was as crucial as the architect with his plans. Consider the Roman aqueduct, a graceful arcade bringing fresh water to a thirsty city. Its construction was a marvel of hydraulic engineering, but its enduring operation was a miracle of bureaucracy. Once built, an aqueduct did not run itself. It required constant, meticulous care. The Roman state appointed a curator aquarum, a curator of waters, a senior official whose sole responsibility was the aqueduct system. He managed a permanent staff of architects, engineers, and a small army of enslaved and free workers. Their duties were minutely regulated. Teams regularly inspected every mile of the channel, cleaning out silt and repairing cracks before they became breaches. They policed the land around the aqueducts, preventing farmers from illegally tapping the flow for irrigation. The curator himself adjudicated disputes over water rights, deciding how much water went to public fountains, imperial baths, or private villas. His budget for maintenance, funded by state and private fees, was a line item in the imperial accounts. The aqueduct was not a static monument. It was a living, managed utility, and its continuous flow for centuries was a testament to a bureaucracy that understood maintenance as a permanent, funded duty. This logistical mindset reached its zenith in the management of labor. The Great Wall of China, as consolidated by the Qin dynasty, is the classic example. The popular image is of endless conscripted toilers, and while hardship was certainly part of the story, the project's scale demanded something beyond brute force. It demanded organization. The state did not simply round up peasants and point them at a mountain. It created a structured system. Labor was often levied as a form of tax, a period of mandatory service owed to the state. Officials organized these workers into crews with foremen. They established supply lines to deliver food, tools, and building materials like stone, and tamped earth to remote construction sites along the northern frontier. Military units were stationed not just to defend the builders, but to oversee the work and manage logistics. There were even records, precursors to modern time sheets, that tracked a worker's period of service. This was project management on a continental scale, turning a defensive idea into a physical reality through a relentless focus on quotas, supply chains, and hierarchical control. The true product was not just a wall, but the administrative machinery that could conceive of and execute such a project. Similarly, the vast network of Roman roads, those famous arteries of empire, were built by the legions themselves during seasonal pauses in campaigning. But this was not casual ditch digging. It was a regimented engineering operation. A military surveyor would chart the straightest, most stable route. Soldiers would then excavate the roadbed to a precise depth, lay a foundation of sand or small stones, add layers of gravel and crushed cement, and finally surface it with fitted stone slabs. They built culverts for drainage and mile markers for distance. Each legionary was a soldier, but he was also a trained laborer, following standardized procedures that produced the same quality of road in Britannia as in Syria. The road was a military asset, but its construction was a bureaucratic exercise in uniform technique and resource allocation. The funding for these mega-projects reveals another layer of administrative ingenuity. Money came from the imperial treasury, often funded by war booty or specific taxes, but also from the fortunes of wealthy citizens seeking prestige. A Roman senator might fund a new bridge or bath complex in his hometown, not just as charity, but as a calculated political investment, with his name inscribed on the dedication. The state thus leveraged private wealth for public works, blending public and private financing in a complex dance of patronage and propaganda. In the end, these physical networks, the roads, canals, and walls, were the ultimate expression of the bureaucratic mind. They were the empire's skeleton, its circulatory system, and its skin all at once. They made the territory tangible and governable, physically binding the provinces to the capital. But they also represented a colossal bet on the future, an investment of decades of labor and treasure into a static structure. The administrators who greenlit these projects were gambling that the empire they served would last long enough to reap the benefits, that the peace enforced by the wall or the prosperity brought by the road would justify the immense cost. It was bureaucracy thinking in centuries, not just fiscal years, shaping the very landscape to match the empire's vision of eternal order. A professional army is an administrative beast. It does not live off the land it defends. It must be fed, paid, equipped, and replaced by a system that functions with clockwork precision, often thousands of miles from the capital. This was the ultimate test of an empire's hidden machinery, the military administrative complex. Its purpose was to transform individual men into a permanent, predictable instrument of power, and it did so through a relentless focus on the details of daily life in the legion. The first challenge was creating the soldier himself. Recruitment was not a haphazard affair. In the Roman system, for instance, a young man volunteering for the legions would have his details, his name, age, physical description, and place of origin meticulously recorded in a central register. He swore a sacred oath, the sacramentum, binding him to the emperor and the state for a standard term of 25 years. This contract was not just symbolic, it was a bureaucratic fact that defined the next quarter century of his life. His pay was equally systematic. A Roman legionary did not receive a lump sum. He received a regular stipend from which deductions were automatically taken for his food, his equipment, and his burial club. The remainder was deposited into a military savings account, accessible upon his honorable discharge. This system of regular, predictable pay was revolutionary. It prevented the discontent of unpaid troops, a classic cause of mutiny, and it tied the soldier's long-term financial security directly to his continued service and good conduct. The state was not just his commander, it was his banker, but pay alone does not forge an army. Equipment does. The image of a uniform Roman legionary, clad in segmented plate armor and bearing a rectangular shield, is a testament to imperial standardization. This uniformity was not an aesthetic choice, it was a logistical one. State-owned factories or fabrici, staffed by skilled workers and often veterans, mass-produced armor, weapons, and tools to precise specifications. A sword forged in a workshop in Gaul had to be interchangeable with one made in Syria. This allowed for centralized supply and repair, turning the legion into a machine with replaceable parts. When a soldier's helmet was damaged, he did not commission a local blacksmith. He went through his centurion to the unit's clerks to requisition a standard replacement from the legion stores. The most vivid window into this daily bureaucratic reality comes from a frontier outpost at the edge of the Roman world, Vindolanda in northern Britain. Here, in the damp soil, hundreds of thin wooden writing tablets were preserved, their inked cursive Latin still readable. These are not grand histories, they are the paperwork of a working garrison. We read lists of supplies, accounts of food and drink, and personal letters that reveal the mundane heartbeat of empire. One tablet is a strength report for the first cohort of Tungrians, itemizing how many soldiers were present, how many were sick, and how many were away on detached duties. Another is a request for more beer to be sent to the fort. There is a birthday party invitation from the commander's wife to a friend. Most tellingly, there are requisitions for everything from wheat and barley to, famously, socks, sandals, and underpants for the soldiers. Every spearhead, every artillery bolt for the giant crossbows called ballistae, every cloak and pair of boots was accounted for by military clerks, the librarii. These men kept the ledgers that tracked what came in from the supply trains and what was issued out to the centuries. The legion was, in essence, a self-contained bureaucratic city that could move. It had its own accountants, its own surveyors, its own legal officers to adjudicate disputes. Its commander was as much a manager as a warrior, responsible for a budget and a payroll as much as for tactics. This system extended to the end of a soldier's service. Veteran settlement was a calculated imperial policy. Upon retirement, a legionary was often granted a plot of land in a frontier province or a sum of money. This was not mere gratitude, it was strategic. It planted loyal, militarily trained populations in recently pacified regions, creating a built-in defense force and accelerating Romanization. The veteran became a stable, tax-paying citizen, his loyalty cemented by the land he now owned, courtesy of the state. The entire life cycle of the soldier, from recruitment to retirement, was thus absorbed into the administrative machine. His body, his time, his skills, and his future were all catalogued, managed, and utilized by the empire. The might of Rome did not march on courage alone. It marched on meticulously maintained records of socks, beer, and payroll deductions. This was the paradox of imperial power. Its greatest force was also its most demanding client, requiring a bottomless well of paperwork to sustain its sharp, cutting edge. Yet this intricate machinery was designed for a world of predictable seasons and steady obedience. Its true nature was revealed not in times of peace, but when the predictable rhythms shattered, when famine stalked the land, illness swept through cities, or rebellion flared along a distant frontier. These were the moments that stress tested the administrative framework, revealing whether it was a resilient network or a fragile facade. In the face of a widespread food shortage, the system's logistical prowess faced its ultimate challenge. The Roman annona, the grain dole, was a tool of political calm in good times, but in a famine it became a lifeline. The bureaucracy had to shift from routine distribution to emergency triage. Officials would first attempt to assess the severity of the shortage through reports from provincial governors and local granary inventories. Then, they might implement a series of escalating measures. They could increase the grain ration per person, though this risked depleting reserves too quickly. They might use state funds to purchase additional grain from regions less affected, leveraging the empire's trade networks in a desperate bid to redirect food. In extreme cases, they would even organize the movement of people, relocating populations from starving districts to areas with better supplies. The success of these efforts depended entirely on the accuracy of the records and the integrity of the officials executing them. A corrupt provincial governor might hoard grain for speculative profit, while a distant emperor relying on flawed reports might believe the crisis was less severe than it truly was. The system's ability to manage a famine was a direct measure of its honesty and its reach. Could it see the truth of the suffering, and could it move resources fast enough to alleviate it? The answer often determined whether a natural disaster remained a tragedy or escalated into a political catastrophe that could topple regimes. Plague presented a different kind of test, one of information control and social order. Ancient administrations had no concept of germ theory, but they understood contagion and the need to isolate the sick to protect the functioning of the state. During outbreaks like the Antonine Plague that swept the Roman Empire in the 2nd century, the bureaucratic response was a mix of practical containment and religious appeasement. Municipal officials were tasked with enforcing quarantines, though these were crude by modern standards. They might restrict movement in and out of affected cities or neighborhoods. The state would organize the disposal of the deceased, a massive and dangerous logistical operation to prevent further spread of illness. Temples and state funds were often directed to support those who were ill and to honor the gods in hopes of lifting the affliction. The bureaucracy's role was to maintain basic civic functions, like ensuring a water supply and some semblance of law and order, even as the social fabric frayed. Tax collection might be suspended in ravaged regions, a recognition by the center that pushing for revenue in a time of mass loss was both impossible and politically explosive. The administrative systems showed a capacity for adaptation, bending their normal rules to meet an unprecedented crisis, though often overwhelmed by the scale of the suffering. But the most deliberate stress test came from human defiance, rebellion. Uprisings were often a direct symptom of bureaucratic failure, a sign that the system had become a burden rather than a framework. A provincial rebellion usually started with a specific grievance, often rooted in the very tools of control we have discussed. Perhaps it was the relentless extraction of a tax farmer, pushing a community into debt and desperation. Maybe it was a corrupt local magistrate whose rulings consistently favored a wealthy landowner dispossessing smaller farmers. Or it could be a cultural overreach, like an emperor's decree that violated a deeply held local religious practice. The rebellion itself then became a crisis of information and response. The first question for the central authority was, how quickly did they know? If the local governor was the one rebelling, he would naturally cut or distort the communication lines, the very roads and couriers built to prevent such an event. The empire's nervous system would go dark in that region. If the rebellion was a popular uprising against a governor, the speed of the reports depended on the loyalty of the remaining officials and military commanders. Once aware, the bureaucratic machine swung into a different mode, shifting from peacetime administration to wartime mobilization. This is where all those meticulous records proved their worth or their worthlessness. The census lists and land registers became conscription lists and maps for asset confiscation. The state could, in theory, identify every able-bodied man of military age in the loyal provinces and levy new troops with chilling efficiency. It could seize the property of known rebels with precision, using the cadastral surveys to identify exact plots of land and vineyards to be confiscated and redistributed to loyal veterans. The treasury would reallocate funds, diverting tax grain from peaceful regions to supply the armies marching to suppress the revolt. The outcome of a rebellion thus revealed the true strength of the administrative web. A swift, decisive suppression showed that the systems of communication, recruitment, and supply were robust, that the center could project overwhelming force before the rebellion could consolidate. A prolonged, grinding conflict, however, exposed brittleness. It showed that the information systems were too slow, that provincial loyalties were shallow, that the logistical chains were too long and vulnerable. Sometimes the bureaucracy itself was the cause of the revolt, and its very tools were used to crush the dissent its own failures had created. In these moments of crisis, the hidden gears of empire were no longer silent. The grind of their operation became audible to everyone, from the emperor in his council chamber to the farmer hiding from tax collectors or soldiers. The system was forced to adapt, to show whether it could learn and correct its own excesses, or whether it would simply break under the pressure, taking the entire imperial idea down with it. But the very systems designed for stability carried the seeds of their own undoing. A bureaucracy, once it proves successful, faces a powerful temptation to grow. It adds more officials to oversee other officials, creates new forms to track old processes, and layers regulations upon regulations. This expansion, known as bureaucratic bloat, begins as a sign of health but can slowly morph into a fatal disease for an empire. The machinery of control becomes so heavy, so expensive, and so slow that it can no longer adapt, eventually grinding the state it was built to serve to a halt. Consider the tax code, initially a tool for fair and predictable revenue. Over generations, as new situations arose, exceptions were carved out for powerful interest groups, and loopholes were closed with ever more specific rules. What began as a simple assessment on land and harvest could evolve into a labyrinthine document hundreds of pages long, interpretable only by a specialized class of legal scribes. This complexity did not just confuse the farmer, it actively stifled the economy. A merchant contemplating a new venture had to weigh not only market risks, but also the unpredictable cost of navigating the tax regulations. Innovation and investment were choked by administrative uncertainty. The system, designed to extract wealth, ended up discouraging the very activity that created that wealth. Meanwhile, the human element of the bureaucracy faced its own decay. The position of the scribe, once a merit-based gateway for talented commoners, could harden into a hereditary office. Fathers passed their posts to their sons not based on skill but on birthright. This created a closed, self-interested class more focused on preserving their family's privileges and extracting unofficial fees, what we might call bribes, than on serving the state efficiently. Corruption shifted from a risk to an embedded cost of doing business. A farmer needed to pay a little extra to get his land survey processed. A merchant needed to grease a palm to move goods through a checkpoint. This silent tax of corruption diverted resources from the imperial treasury into private pockets, while eroding public trust in the fairness of the entire system. The state was being hollowed out from within by its own servants. The most crushing weight, however, was the sheer financial cost of maintenance. The empire had built a magnificent machine, but the fuel bill was astronomical. The professional army demanded constant pay, equipment, and pensions. The thousands of clerks, inspectors, and governors required salaries. The road networks, aqueducts, and granaries needed endless repair. All of this was funded by a tax base that could only stretch so far. In the later Roman Empire, historians note the treasury was caught in a vicious cycle. To defend the frontiers, it needed more soldiers. To pay more soldiers, it needed higher taxes. But higher taxes pushed small farmers into debt, forcing them to sell their land to wealthy aristocrats who often had the political connections to avoid taxation. The tax base actually shrank even as the demands on it grew. Emperors resorted to desperate measures like debasing the coinage, mixing less and less silver into the coins to make the metal stretch further. This led to price inflation, a silent thief that eroded the value of everyone's savings and the soldiers' pay, further destabilizing the realm. A similar dynamic strained the later Han Dynasty in China. The cost of maintaining the northern armies against nomadic incursions, coupled with the expenses of a vast imperial court and a growing landed gentry that avoided taxes, created a permanent fiscal crisis. The state responded by imposing heavier burdens on the free peasantry, the one group it could reliably tax. This pushed countless families into hardship, creating a pool of discontent that fueled massive rebellions like the Yellow Turban Uprising. The bureaucracy, now bloated and often corrupt, proved incapable of reforming itself or alleviating the suffering. It continued to function, but its motions became empty ritual, a complex dance of paperwork that no longer addressed the real problems tearing the empire apart. The system's greatest failure was its inability to shrink, to simplify, to shed weight when circumstances changed. It was built for growth and control, not for contraction or adaptation. So the very networks of roads that had bound the empire together now facilitated its pillaging by invaders. The detailed census records became useless as populations fled or vanished. The granaries stood empty. The bureaucracy did not suddenly vanish. It simply became a ghost in the machine, going through the motions of governance long after the power to truly govern had faded. This is the paradoxical legacy of imperial administration. It was the indispensable foundation for greatness, enabling unity, justice, and prosperity on a scale previously unimaginable. Yet, in its success, it cultivated the excesses that would lead to fragility. The story of its rise is always shadowed by the story of its slow, costly, and inevitable decline. The ultimate expression of this administrative drive is found not in slow evolution, but in a sudden, violent revolution of order. In the 3rd century before the Common Era, the state of Qin, long considered a brutal frontier kingdom by its rivals, unleashed a bureaucratic system of such ruthless efficiency that it conquered all of China. This was not rule by tradition or virtue, but rule by system, a philosophy called legalism. Its goal was absolute state power, and it achieved this by treating human society as a machine to be calibrated with precise, unforgiving laws. The Qin blueprint for empire was a masterclass in administrative control, demonstrating how far standardization could be pushed and where its breaking point might lie. The first step was erasing local difference. The Qin chancellor, Lai Si, understood that a fractured landscape of scripts made unified rule impossible. He mandated a single, simplified writing system, banning all regional variants. Suddenly, a decree from the capital meant the same thing in every village. But the standardization did not stop with words. The Qin mandated uniform weights and measures across the realm, replacing a chaotic array of local standards. They even standardized the axle widths of carts, so every wagon would fit the ruts of the new imperial road network they were building. This was a physical engineering of conformity, ensuring that people, goods, and information could flow without friction anywhere in the new empire. The intent was to make the territory not just politically unified, but operationally identical, a single, vast workshop for state projects. The heart of the legalist machine was its law code, a system of rewards and punishments so severe it aimed to eliminate individual choice. The laws were publicly displayed, clear, and brutally simple. Rewards, often promotions in rank or material benefits, were generous for those who followed orders and exceeded state quotas, particularly in agriculture or warfare. But the punishments for failure or disobedience were draconian. The system operated on the principle of collective responsibility. Families and neighborhoods were grouped into units of 5 or 10 households. Every person in that unit was held accountable for the actions of every other. If one member committed a crime and was not reported, the entire group faced severe punishment. This turned society into a web of mutual surveillance, where your neighbor's loyalty was not a matter of goodwill, but a necessity for your own survival. Informing on others became a civic duty and a personal safeguard. The state, through this mechanism, inserted itself into the most intimate social bonds, transforming community trust into a lever for control. To make this system function, the Qin perfected the administrative tool of household registration to an unprecedented degree. Every family was required to register with the local magistrate, listing all members, their ages, and their relationships. This was not a one-time census, but a constantly updated living record. Officials could track population movement, identify men of military age, and assign tax and labor obligations with pinpoint accuracy. There was no anonymity, no place to hide from the state's accounting. This meticulous registry was the fuel gauge for the imperial engine, telling the rulers exactly how much human resource they could extract for their grand ambitions. And extract they did. This hyper-efficient bureaucracy enabled staggering achievements. It mobilized armies of unprecedented size to crush rival states. It coordinated the labor of hundreds of thousands to build not only the early linkages of the Great Wall, but also a vast network of roads and the emperor's colossal tomb guarded by the terracotta army. The system could move people and material with a cold, relentless logic that made the impossible merely a matter of logistics. For a time, the machine worked flawlessly, forging China's first truly unified empire from a continent of warring kingdoms. Yet the fuel for this machine was human suffering. The very efficiency that built monuments also demanded unbearable hardship. The labor conscripted for the wall, and the roads was often worked to exhaustion under harsh conditions. The legal system, for all its clarity, was inflexible and merciless, leaving little room for compassion or circumstance. The culture of informing bred fear and resentment, eroding the social fabric. The Qin state saw its people primarily as components, as sources of tax and labor. When the first emperor died, the system he built had no soft edges, no reservoir of popular loyalty to cushion the transition. The bureaucracy remained, but it was a hated instrument. The resentment it had accumulated over years of relentless pressure exploded into widespread rebellion. The very household registers that gave the state its power now provided rebels with a clear map of communities ready to rise up. The Qin dynasty, for all its administrative genius, collapsed in less than 4 years after its founder's passing, consumed by the fires its own ruthless systems had sparked. It left behind a powerful lesson. A bureaucracy could be engineered to conquer and build with breathtaking speed. But if it operated without a concept of human limits or goodwill, it risked becoming a prison that its own inmates would eventually burn down. The Qin blueprint was inherited by the next dynasty, the Han, who kept its administrative framework but carefully grafted onto it a softer philosophy of rule, understanding that an empire needed more than just efficiency to endure. It needed the consent, however reluctant, of the governed. While the Qin model was a blueprint of rigid control, Rome built its empire on a foundation of pragmatic adaptation. Its bureaucracy was not a single, perfect design imposed from the start, but a sprawling, evolving patchwork stitched together over centuries to meet the demands of governing a diverse and ever-expanding world. This flexible, often messy approach was a key source of its remarkable endurance. In the early Republic, administration was a part-time affair for the elite. Senators and magistrates handled state business with the help of small, personal households of enslaved and freed secretaries. There was no civil service in the modern sense, just a network of aristocratic obligation and personal loyalty. As Rome swallowed the Mediterranean, this informal system strained to its breaking point. The answer was not a top-down revolution, but a series of layered additions. By the time of the late Empire, under emperors like Diocletian and Constantine, This had crystallized into a formal hierarchical structure of departments known as officia. Each high official, from a provincial governor to the praetorian prefect, had his own officium, a staff of hundreds of clerks, accountants, legal advisors, and messengers. These were career bureaucrats, often of equestrian rank, who formed a professional administrative class separate from the old senatorial aristocracy. The empire had effectively built a dedicated operating system. What made this system Roman was its relentless pragmatism. Unlike the Qin's drive for cultural uniformity, Rome was a master of incorporation. It rarely sought to erase local power structures, instead it co-opted them. A local landowning elite in Gaul or Greece could maintain their status, their language, and many of their traditions, provided they accepted Roman overlordship, paid their taxes, and supplied men for the armies. These local elites were often granted Roman citizenship, and their sons could rise through the imperial ranks. They became the essential intermediaries, translating Roman demands into local context and ensuring stability. This created a powerful incentive for cooperation, tying the fortunes of provincial aristocracies directly to the health of the empire itself. This pragmatism extended to the very collection of revenue. Rome never settled on a single, pure system. It famously employed tax farmers, the publicani, especially in the Republican era, accepting the social friction they caused for the upfront cash and administrative simplicity they provided. Yet it also developed a core of imperial procurators, salaried financial agents who reported directly to the emperor, overseeing imperial estates and collecting certain taxes. In the later empire, as the abuses of tax farming grew too severe, the state shifted more toward direct collection by its own officials, though never completely eliminating private contractors. It was a constant, messy calibration, choosing the tool that seemed to work for the time and place, balancing efficiency against the risk of rebellion. Governance, too, was a hybrid model. In frontier provinces, the line between military and civil command was often blurred, with a legate governing a territory and commanding its legions. In peaceful, interior provinces, civil governors held sway, with the military reporting through separate channels. This flexible deployment of authority allowed Rome to apply a heavier hand where it was needed for security, and a lighter touch in long pacified regions. The system's great strength was this ability to be different things in different places, all while maintaining a cohesive, overarching framework of law and ultimate loyalty to the emperor. This very adaptability, however, bred a complexity that became its own burden. By the 4th century, the bureaucracy had become a vast, multi-layered machine. The reforms of Diocletian divided the empire into over 100 provinces, grouped into dioceses, which were then grouped into 4 massive prefectures. Each layer required its own governor, its own staff, its own paperwork. A petition from a remote village might now have to travel through 4 levels of administration before reaching an official with the power to decide. The system grew slower, more expensive, and more rigid even as it tried to manage an empire under immense external pressure. The pragmatic patchwork had become a heavy, intricate tapestry, difficult to mend and impossible to quickly reshape. Yet for centuries, this layered, incorporating, and flexible approach allowed Rome to govern an unprecedented diversity of peoples across 3 continents. It was a bureaucracy built not on a philosopher's ideal, but on a soldier's and an accountant's real-world experience, a system designed less for perfect order and more for lasting control. The statue of the emperor stands alone, a solitary colossus of marble and bronze. Official histories tell of his divine will and decisive commands, as if the empire moved in perfect obedience to his solitary thought. This was the necessary myth, the propaganda of omnipotence projected onto coins, carved into temple walls and recited by poets. But step behind that gleaming facade, into the dimly lit rooms of any provincial administration building, and you would find the true engine of power. It was not a throne, but a writing desk, The real story of empire is the story of the gap between that mythic image and the paper-pushing reality that sustained it. Consider the pharaoh of ancient Egypt. In temple reliefs, he is depicted as a god-king, towering over puny enemies, personally presenting offerings to the deities who guaranteed the Nile's life-giving flood. The art proclaims a simple truth: the pharaoh's divine essence alone ensures the harvest, but the administrative reality was a humbler, more human endeavor. The pharaoh's actual power depended on a corps of scribes who could not command the river, but who could measure it. These officials operated nilometers, stone staircases marked with increments descending into the river. They recorded the water's rise and fall with meticulous care. Their calculations, not royal decrees, predicted the flood's bounty. Based on those numbers, other scribes in distant offices would consult the cadastral surveys, the land registers, and then calculate the expected tax yield from every field in the kingdom. The pharaoh might be depicted as the source of all fertility, but the empire ate because clerks with reed brushes and papyrus scrolls had mastered the mundane mathematics of mud and water. The Roman Empire perfected this duality. The emperor's portrait was stamped on every silver denarius, his stern profile a daily reminder of whose peace guaranteed the coin's value. He was the pater patriae, the father of the fatherland, a unifying symbol for 100 different peoples. Yet the unity he symbolized was forged in countless provincial accounting offices. Take a city like Ephesus or Alexandria. Here, municipal magistrates and their staffs were responsible for collecting the local taxes that fed into the imperial system. They maintained records of property owners, negotiated contracts for public works, and ensured the grain shipments for the annona were loaded on time. Their work was a relentless tide of inventory lists, receipts, and correspondence. When the emperor in Rome issued an edict lowering a tax or granting a privilege, it was these local accountants who had to adjust their ledgers, recalibrate the assessments, and ensure the new policy actually functioned on the ground. The emperor's face on the coin was a symbol of authority, but the coin's purchasing power depended on the integrity of the financial bureaucracy that managed the silver supply and policed against forgery. The imperial image promised stability from the top down, but stability was actually built from the bottom up, through the routine execution of 1,000 boring tasks. This gap between myth and mechanism was not a flaw, it was a feature. The god-king or the unconquered son emperor needed to appear above the fray, a timeless source of order. That lofty image freed the bureaucracy below to do the messy, practical work of compromise, calculation, and correction without tarnishing the crown's aura of infallibility. A tax rebate for a region struck by a poor harvest could be issued by a faceless financial procurator, allowing the emperor to still be celebrated in that province as a benevolent father. An unpopular census could be carried out by provincial officials, absorbing the local resentment, while the central authority could claim it was merely gathering information for the common good. The system provided plausible deniability and operational flexibility. The true genius of imperial power lay precisely in this division of labor. The ruler embodied the myth, the ideal of unity and divine favor. The bureaucracy managed the mechanism, the unglamorous reality of quotas, supply chains, and legal disputes. One inspired loyalty and fear, the other ensured the grain ships sailed and the soldiers were paid. They were two sides of the same coin, one brilliantly minted for public display, the other endlessly counted in dusty back rooms. To understand an empire, then, you must learn to read past the monumental propaganda. Look for the clay tablet that lists the missing spears from a frontier fort's armory. Find the papyrus fragment that is a humble petition from a farmer about a disputed well. Decode the knotted cords of a quipu that recorded tributes of beans and wool. In these quiet documents, you will not find the echo of a ruler's boast, but the steady heartbeat of the system that made the boast possible. The monuments tell us what the empire wanted to be remembered for. The paperwork tells us how it actually functioned day after ordinary day, far from the glittering capital. That statue of the emperor and the scribe's desk are not relics of a forgotten past. They are the twin pillars of a story that never truly ended. The administrative frameworks forged in the ancient world did not vanish with the empires that created them. Instead, they shattered into fragments of genius that were collected, reassembled, and refined by every large-scale society that followed. The bureaucratic DNA of Rome, Persia, and China is woven directly into the operating system of the modern nation-state. We still live in a world they helped invent. Take the simple act of buying a pound of flour. The concept of a standardized pound, guaranteed by a national bureau of standards, is a direct descendant of the royal cubit of Egypt and the Qin dynasty's uniform weights. That guarantee is what allows commerce to function on a mass scale, creating trust between strangers who will never meet. It is the same principle that allowed a Persian daric to be accepted from the Aegean to the Indus, only now it is managed by a government agency instead of a royal mint. Our modern census is a direct evolution of those Roman and Han registries. Every 10 years, a nation still attempts to count its people, not just for representation, but to understand its own capacity. The data determines funding for hospitals, the planning of schools, and the routing of infrastructure. The ancient census told an emperor where his soldiers and grain were. Our census tells a government where its citizens and needs are. The methodology is more sophisticated, involving satellites and statistics, but the fundamental purpose, to make a population legible to its rulers, is unchanged. The flickering screen of a tracking number for a package is the spiritual heir to the Persian Angarium. Our global logistics networks, with their planes, trucks, and digital handoffs, operate on the same relay principle perfected on the Royal Road. The message, now a physical parcel or a data packet, never sleeps. It moves through a system of way stations, from sorting hub to delivery van, creating an expectation of speed and reliability that would have stunned Herodotus. The state's monopoly on this flow of information and goods remains a cornerstone of power and economic life. Perhaps the most profound legacy is the idea of a professional, salaried civil service. The Han Dynasty's scholar officials, selected by examination, established a model that aimed to separate governance from birthright. This ideal of a bureaucracy based on merit and managed by rules rather than personal patronage is the bedrock of modern public administration. The complex hiring processes, the standardized pay grades, the codes of conduct for public servants, all trace a line back to those ancient attempts to create a class of administrators loyal to the system itself, rather than to a local warlord or a family clan. And where is the memory of the state held today? In vast digital archives, server farms humming in climate-controlled buildings, storing everything from property deeds and tax returns to legislative records and court rulings. These are the high-tech descendants of the Tabularium in Rome and the clay tablet storerooms of Babylon. They serve the same essential function: to preserve institutional memory, to provide precedent, and to create a permanent, retrievable record of the state's actions and obligations. The medium has changed from papyrus to pixels, but the mandate is ancient. This continuity reveals a startling truth. The great challenge of the ancient world, how to organize human cooperation across vast distances and deep differences, is still our great challenge. The solutions they pioneered, the tools of standardization, information management, and systematic oversight, are the very tools we still use, just amplified by technology. When you file your taxes online, you are interacting with a system whose logic was first scratched onto clay in Mesopotamia. When you vote in an election organized by civil servants, you are participating in a process refined by Roman magistrates and Chinese imperial examiners. These ancient bureaucracies were not just administrative machines, They were social technologies, some of humanity's first and most durable experiments in building complex, cooperative societies. They were the prototypes. We are still living in their upgraded and sometimes bewildering final release. The true currency of empire was not gold but information. Every basket of grain counted, every soldier's name recorded, every road surveyed. These were the fundamental transactions. An empire was at its core a vast information processing and resource allocating machine. Its genius was not in the charisma of its rulers or the ferocity of its armies, though those captured the imagination, but in its ability to see, to count, and to move. The glittering palaces and epic battlefields were the drama, but the hidden bureaucracies were the stage, the script, and the crew that made the performance possible for centuries. They solved the ancient world's most intractable problem, the tyranny of distance and diversity. By creating a common language of administration, they built bridges of data across mountain ranges and cultural divides, turning a collection of disparate lands into a single, functioning organism. The paradox is profound. We remember the names of emperors and the dates of conquests, but the true architects of imperial endurance were the anonymous clerks, the surveyors with their measuring cords, the archivists shelving clay tablets. A meticulously kept tax roll did more to secure a frontier than 1,000 cavalrymen, because it paid for their horses and their food. A fast relay of couriers did more to prevent rebellion than a legion, because it allowed the center to respond before dissent could coalesce. These systems of lists, ledgers, and reports were the silent, steady heartbeat of power. They were the definitive technology of empire, more enduring than any monument. To understand this changes how we see history. It shifts our gaze from the throne room to the record room, from the general's tent to the quartermaster's ledger. It reveals that the grand narratives of civilization were underwritten by the humble, relentless work of administration. The next time you see an ancient coin or walk along the stones of an old road, look past the symbol of the ruler. Think of the system that minted that coin to a standard weight, and the bureaucracy that maintained that road for the couriers who carried the empire's will. History is not just the story of great individuals, it is the story of the frameworks they built and the often invisible people who kept them running. If you found this journey into the hidden wiring of the ancient world compelling, consider subscribing. We explore the unseen frameworks, the quiet systems, and the overlooked innovations that truly shaped our past, and in doing so, help us understand the complex world we live in today.